All right, welcome to another podcast from Faith Baptist Church in Visalia. My name is Eric Northuck, and I am one of the pastors here. And this podcast is all about who God is and how that should affect us and how we should live in light of who He is. And so we want to talk about all things that are related to God's purposes for us and for the church. And today we have an opportunity to do that with Joseph Rios, who is with us today. Joseph, welcome.
Glad to be here.
And Joseph is going out into the mission field as a military chaplain in serving the soldiers. And so he'll be leaving when?
I will be leaving on the 11th.
On the 11th of this month, and you'll be gone for how long?
3 months. I should be returning on December 14th.
Okay, so Joseph is going off to the mission field, and this Sunday we're going to take some time to send him off and to pray for him as he goes. But I thought it would be interesting to interview Joseph and find out what he's doing and why he's doing it. So to begin with, Joseph, you're a graduate from TMS. You and I went to TMS together, and you got your MDiv there at TMS. Graduated, I think it was a year after I did. Yeah. And so I've known you. When did I first meet you? I'm trying to remember. How did I first meet you? Do you remember?
Yes. So I had just become an intern at a nearby church, and so I needed to rent out what I was using to live in when I went to seminary, which was a 32-foot travel trailer. And I'd actually spoken with a couple of people before I met you, but when I met you, I met someone who knew the ins and outs of what they were going to have to be dealing with in light of that, and who happened to already be in something of a very small trailer for the amount of people. And this was kind of an upgrade. So
yeah, we're upgrading, 7 kids in our motorhome. We're upgrading to your trailer.
Right. And so it was the process of that where we met each other, and then we developed a relationship going from there.
And then you were an intern at the church up there in it was in Lancaster, right?
Correct. It's a Roosevelt Community Church,
right? In
Lancaster. The teaching pastor there is Brian Murphy, who's one of the teachers at the Master's Seminary.
Right, he was he was primarily Hebrew. We both had him for Hebrew.
Yes.
And I think I had him for another class, but yeah, I really appreciated his Hebrew.
Foundations of Pastoral Ministry.
Yeah, Foundation, that's right. And then during the COVID era, which I'm not convinced is over, the COVID-19 era, when they shut down the church, we kind of, in a sense, launched our own church during that time, right? And
yes. So I showed up late.
Yeah.
Which is my habit, apparently, between the two of us. But we started gathering together at the property that you were living on that I had lived on prior. And there were more people. For example, the Taylors were there as well.
Donald and Shonda, which our church is familiar with. Some of us are familiar with him. Yeah.
And so we started gathering together. And just as it got going, someone up and left and came to this church. Which, as the habit continued, I came late.
Yeah. So Joseph followed me up here. It was over a year later,
right?
After you graduated, and then you came up here, and so. But you did finish. You got your MDiv, and then you, in the process of figuring out what to do, you also became a chaplain in which branch?
The Army.
The Army, and that's pretty recent.
Yes. So the process started about a year ago, if not a little bit sooner or later than that. So I'm prior enlisted. For those of you who are not familiar with military references, what that means is that I was in the Army before, but as opposed to being an officer, which a chaplain will be, I was a grunt. Specifically, I was in the infantry. And so based on some of the decisions I made on how I was going to leave the military, My first go around, I just really had never imagined. I had bad dreams about it, but I never imagined I'd actually enter back into the military. I didn't think I was going to be able to be honest. And then I started talking to a recruiter after I had graduated. And I thought about how the lack of spiritual support that I had and counsel, particularly biblical counsel, was a reason why it would make a lot of sense for me, especially having the experiences that I had before, to be of use to the soldiers in the Army, to be a light where there's often not much light, if any at all. And so I saw it as an opportunity to be in a solution to what I perceived to be a problem. As opposed to complaining about the problem, I sought to do something about it.
Yeah.
And so that's how I made the decision to join the Army as a chaplain.
And there is a lot of complaining about it, isn't there? There's
Right.
a lot of fear and worry about what's going on in this country and where our military is going, and are there even good men, and how dark it is. And so you chose to, instead of complain, to go ahead and enter into the darkness and do something about it.
Right.
And I want to ask you more specific questions about that. Before I do that, let me just ask you what you've joined the church here. You've been here for a few months now. What have you been doing around here? What has been your role? How have you been serving here, our Church Faith Baptist here in Visalia?
Okay, so that's a few questions, and so I'll try to separate it so that it makes sense. As far as like I work here, and my primary focus in working here is the cleaning of the facility and the maintenance and renovation of it. And so, for example, I put the floors in that are in the foyer and that mediating hallway between the chapel and the main worship area. And with the help of some wonderful men like Eric.
Not me. I appreciate the
Kitchen,
compliment, but
Eric Kitchen and Bob Everhart. I was able to make it really with their help.
Yeah.
What it is now. And if you see any mistakes, it's probably me, not them.
Yeah.
And so things like that, kind of clearing out some spaces that haven't been being used, and so that way they can be used. So, for example, the office that we're sitting in to work on this podcast has been converted into an office. So then that way the room, which hasn't seen much use over the years, can become useful. And so we can be glorifying God with not just merely the possession of the church, but the use of the building.
Yeah, I just jump in just a minute regarding the facility the facility remodeled. This remodel project in the lobby, the church voted on. It's been, I don't know if it's been 2 years or 3 years when there was a vote to remodel the lobby, and then there was a vote to. There's a couple other things that have been voted on by the church body, and it was difficult to get things done. And so the deacons agreed to, or thought it would be wise to bring on somebody who could do these projects in-house and at least could facilitate it so we can get done what what the congregation had asked us to do. And so that's, you've been very, very helpful. It's been great to have these projects that have been piling up, that have been voted on, and then all of a sudden they're getting done. And we're I don't know if we're halfway through it yet. There's some other. The church voted on doing some things in the auditorium. I think new projectors, some lighting, and then also our cameras, our security system. So there's still some work. So maybe we're halfway through those things. And so Joseph has been very helpful in that, and then also the cleaning and the just organizing and trying to get the facility into shape. We've got a lot more work to go, but I've been happy with the results, and so anyway.
And then to elaborate, the ways I've been serving. So I've always had a passion, and this would make sense in light of what I'm doing in terms of mission and chaplaincy. But I've always, since I've come to faith, had an urgent sense of the need to proclaim the gospel and to make Christ known to unbelievers and exhort those who have heard him to repent and submit in light of his kept promises. And so I've been involved or kind of heading up a lot of the evangelism. By no means am I the only person doing it. Your son Micah is going to be helping me out with it while I'm gone. But we do our Tuesday evangelism. We do door to door around the neighborhood because I think that our neighbors should know who we are. And then on Saturday, we go down to downtown now. We've started off in the mall, but then they didn't want the gospel there. And then we went to the farmer's market, and then they didn't want the gospel there. And it's kind of a gray area in terms of public and private use of property. But there's no gray area when it comes to downtown. Mm. So we have taken advantage of that, and that's where we do our primary Saturday efforts.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed that. It was when we were in the mall, one of the ladies had a security guard come up to her and tell her that, you guys can't be passing out religious material and sharing the gospel. And I'll never forget what she did. She says, "Oh, okay." And then she's like, can I ask you a question? Or maybe she had the living water, where you...
It's an optical illusion.
Optical illusion. Which one's bigger?
Right. And then she started witnessing.
She just started sharing the gospel with a security guard. And I think it took him by surprise, and he was drawn into this discussion, and forced to confront his own spiritual need, and then it was like this moment where he's like, wait, hold on a minute, I'm supposed to be kicking him out, like what's going on here? And I remembered that because when we went to the farmer's market, I had the lady, the manager of the market, come up and do the same thing to me, and I remembered what had happened in the mall. And she said, "Well, you can't be doing this." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, let me ask you a question." And then I just started sharing the gospel. And it was the same thing. She was drawn in to that conversation and forced to confront the gospel. And anyway, it's just been successful. And I just, when we were kicked out of the mall and we were kicked out of the farmer's market, each one of those were opportunities where the gospel has gone out. And even on the streets, when we share the gospel, I tell people the goal is conversations, not conversions. A lot of people will think that, it's not successful, it doesn't work because people aren't bowing the knee and giving their lives to Christ. Well, we live in a very dark time, but the gospel is working. It's always working, right? You would agree with that.
Absolutely.
Even when we're kicked out of the mall or kicked out of the farmer's market and you go door to door and we've had doors slammed in our face.
I think in terms of, the right mentality in evangelism, you need to be prepared for Jeremiah's ministry. And I think that if you're prepared for that in terms of not producing repentance and people that are committing to the worship of Yahweh and in our sense, incarnate Christ, if you're not committed to the glory that it brings God apart from his work in their lives, then it's easy to get discouraged or easy to be afraid or easy to, wander off in some kind of pragmatic solution that gets people to say yes, but may very well not bring about true conversion.
Yeah.
And so, I've always kind of lived there in terms of, having that expectation that maybe nobody comes, but that's God's work, not mine. My job is to be faithful.
Yeah.
And so beyond that, we started up this Wednesday evening where we have, the people in the church get together and we enjoy fellowship and food. And then we've been going through the sermons through the fundamentals of the faith, which is a class has been being taught on Saturday. And that's been very good because...
You mean Sunday morning?
Yeah, sorry, Sunday morning. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's been going on Sunday morning. It's been good to be able to do that because I think that we should try to be around each other during the week and spend time with each other. It's easier, especially for those of us who have, issues in our lives, for people to know about them if we are around them. But as well as though we can love each other, we can talk about the true things concerning God. We can learn more about them. And I think that the opportunity to have a little bit of discourse, to have some discussion concerning the things that we're learning helps us have it a little bit more thoroughly understood. There's a tendency sometimes when somebody teaches for, 20, 30 minutes and there's no opportunity to talk, that a person could silently disagree, not have an opportunity to say something, and just walk away thinking, well, we disagree, but wouldn't it be better if we could work it out in the discussion? And so not everybody's forced to do that. So don't be afraid to show up, please.
Yeah. And along with that, in that format, it's perfectly okay to disagree.
Right.
To bring up points, and we've had some of those discussions, I think, and some people find that the worst sin of our day, right, is to disagree. You do not disagree with someone. It's just not nice to disagree, but that doesn't actually help sharpen us. I really do enjoy the conversations that end up sharpening, where there is a disagreement, but it forces you to think, and we can do that in a way that is mature, right? It's not getting angry because you disagree with me, but rather forcing us to think and to be able to present why we believe what we believe much, in a more logical way, and sharpen our thinking.
Right. So. And sometimes, you don't realize that the person sitting right next to you, not necessarily at the front, who's guiding this discussion, has a lot to say and may know a lot, and you have another resource you can go to. So it's just been a very good time of fellowship and food, and theology, and talking about who God is, because the more we know who He is, the better worshipers we are of Him. Yeah. And so those are the things that I've been doing. So between my work and in terms of serving and ministry, I'm also, the husband of one wife and the father of 3 children, and so they keep me busy when I'm not here doing this. And so there are those things too. Mm. And that's, going back to the fact that I'm going to be leaving for a period of time. That's one of the things I'm not looking forward to is not being around my wife and children for the next 3 months.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about evangelism, and I think that we could do an entire podcast on that, and we should. We've talked about the need for fellowship. That's another podcast. But you are leaving for 3 months, and so this podcast is about why you would do that. Why would you leave and leave your family for 3 months and go? Where are you going, to North Carolina?
South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Fort
Jackson, South Carolina. Why would you do that?
Okay, so the military, there's a saying. And it's less pounded on now than it used to be. But the saying used to go that if the military or the army wanted you to have a wife, they would have issued you one. And so they're not invited. That's the only reason why I'm not going with them. But really, so what I'm going to do specifically for the next 3 months is become what's called MOS qualified. And the Army and MOS is your job. Mine's a chaplain. The qualification is the course in which they try to teach you or me how to be the Army's kind of chaplain. And so if you have any experience in life, there's different chaplains who have different areas of expertise. There are sometimes hospital chaplains. There are hospice chaplains. There are chaplains that can be for a team in sports, as well as ones that can be for like law enforcement or fire department, first responders. And so what I'm doing very specifically has to do with the Army. And what that entails is basically being spiritual care, but doing it in a way that is cooperative with the Army's goals. And so there can be tension there sometimes, especially if the individual in the Army who is in charge of the unit that the chaplain is working at has a different idea of what spiritual care should look like. Regardless, my responsibility is to first honor God, then country, which is one of the reasons why who you have as your ecclesiastical endorser, that is the one who the Army goes to see whether or not you're qualified to be a chaplain. It's a kind of a middle agency that makes sure that you're, the one I'm with anyways, make sure I'm part of a church, that I'm that I'm the husband of one wife, that my children are rebellious. They talk to different people like, my pastor and other men that have been involved in my life, like deacons and things like that, to verify whether or not I meet the qualifications of somebody who should be a chaplain from a biblical perspective. But not all endorsing agencies are that way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I did receive a call from your agency asking those questions, which I appreciated, that they're vetting you. So I want to ask you about, you mentioned the tension between God and government. But before I do that, you're going as a reserve, not as active. What's the difference there?
Okay, so if I was active duty when I finished the school, then I would be likely on a base, and the unit that I'm with is who I would spend my day in, day out time with. As a reservist, I meet up with the guys 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. And that means that I have less time with them than I ordinarily would, which makes my time with them a lot more important for me to be paying attention and getting to know them. And so, for example, this last annual training where I was gone for my 2 weeks, I had at least 3 different opportunities to give biblical counsel, because that's the only kind of counsel I give. I, on one Sunday, had the opportunity to preach, twice.
So when you preach, are you able to pretty much say whatever you want to say in that context?
In a sense. So I'll bring up the idea of my endorser maybe more times as we talk about tension between God and government, because they're pivotal in terms of whether or not I have protection to say things. So just to give you kind of an example, the expectation should be from a military perspective that when I communicate, I'm communicating in line with what the ecclesiastical endorser has put forth. And so, for example, their doctrinal statement at that point becomes very important. So I'll give you an example. Point number 1 on their doctrinal statement is the creation of man by a direct act of God. This means that you can't hold to an evolutionary view and be part of this endorsing agency.
Okay, so you're going in as a reserve, and you said 1 weekend a month is your ongoing. Once you get past this 3-month training, that's going to be the norm. Is that did I get that right? 1 weekend a month,
Right?
And then 2 weeks a year,
Right?
Is the normal. But the opportunities you have are because you're endorsed by a certain endorser. It gives you the freedom. Is that am I hearing that right?
To say certain things.
To say certain.
So
things.
let me give you one of the most clear examples. So my endorsing agency is Associated Gospel Churches, and in their mandated policies, which is mandated for me, in talking about the issue of gender, which is interesting because, and this is one of the reasons why I desired to change endorsing agencies, because I did not start with the one that I have, is that I wanted to make sure that my view, if I stated my views, then they would protect me, because they're the ones who get behind me if I deal with somebody being upset and trying to go through official routes. But their section on gender is great. So there's a few paragraphs that precede this in terms of biblical argument, but this is what it says at the end of it. Resolved that we oppose all efforts to validate transgender identity as morally acceptable or praiseworthy, that we will tactfully address all persons by their God-given gender. And be it finally resolved, we lovingly counsel and guide a person to accept that their birth sex and gender is a testimony of the truth of God's design for them, regardless of their sincere feelings, self-perception, or self-identity. And we proclaim that Scripture teaches that what Scripture teaches about God's design for us as male and female persons created in His image and for His glory, according to the teaching of Scripture affirmed in this document.
Okay, so what you're saying is that because this is your endorsing organization, the Association of Churches or whatever,
Gospel churches,
because that is in their doctrinal statement. You have more freedom now. You have to hold to that standard. So they've endorsed you, and then now you're allowed to say that there is only male and female. There's no such thing as transgender.
I cannot violate their policies or doctrinal statement.
Right.
So I am actually, it's not, in one sense, it's not that I'm allowed to, in one sense, it's that I have to,
Right.
because they're my endorser. But if I had an endorsing agency that wasn't so specific on certain issues, and I said a thing like that, and they decided, well, that's not part of our stuff, so we're not going to back you, I would get hung out to dry. And that could be a serious issue. It could be a legal issue for me. And so what endorsing agency a chaplain has everything to do with what they can and can't, or what they're expected to say in terms of the truths of Scripture. And so that's one of the reasons why, after I had initially gained entry through a different agency, I decided to pursue this one, because I wanted to make sure that when I did get into a conversation, which was a day one on transgenderism, I was protected. And so what I did when on that day one, somebody asked me, so what's your thoughts on transgenderism? And I kind of like laughed. I was like, so you're just trying to get me in trouble, right? He goes, no. I just want to know what you have to think about it. And I could tell I had to use some discernment, because I had not transitioned over yet. I had to use some discernment in trying to evaluate, well, is this where I, do I sink the ship before it gets away from port? And so
you could have, you're thinking in that moment, I could blow this whole thing right now by what I say.
Right. And if anybody knows you, or sorry, and like you know me, and if anybody else does, the answer is, okay, well then I guess that's what I'm doing. And so you chose to behave this if this blows up. Well, then this is what I'm going to do. I have to be faithful to what God teaches and deal with the consequences.
So, but your endorsing organization is also mandating that you say that.
Now they are. The one I had when I had this conversation.
Oh, I see.
Did
okay.
Not.
So you had the other endorsing.
No.
So at that time you were out on a limb. You're taking a risk. Okay. So now the conversation would be not necessarily different, but you would have, it could still blow up, because you still have these crazy things that are coming down. I mean, we have military generals now who are transgender, right, and they're getting all this. It's just crazy that it's a laughing stock, if you ask me. Well, so there's a lot of pressure to not speak up against this.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't understand is that in terms of groups that are in the military, because you've got, different types of jobs, being, somebody could be in artillery, somebody could be infantry, somebody could be in HR. There's a lot of different kinds of jobs you can do in the military. The first job that, as it were, that there was is the infantry. The second is a chaplain. The whole point that Washington had in mind with chaplains in the military was that we would have good Christian soldiers. And so when I'm going through training for being a chaplain, not this more rigorous training I'm about to go to, but other training I had taken a couple months ago, they leave that part out. They just talk about how, George Washington instituted this. We're the second in terms of, as a job, but they leave out that it was for Christian soldiers. And that's just a historical statement. The irony is that it seems that if you want to be holding to a consistent Christian worldview, say things that were normal to say 50 to 80 years ago, then they want anything but that kind of soldier. And that's more, I think that has more to do with the military being influenced by the culture, as opposed to having a place where it kind of norms the culture in terms of our view of our country and how we ought to be good citizens and be willing to defend our kinsmen in that way, which are normal biblical concepts. But as we move farther and farther as a culture from a Christian worldview, my job gets clearer and clearer in terms of what I need to do and the importance of it.
So we're full on into this discussion of balancing responsibility to God and government now, and so let me just throw this out there, playing devil's advocate. Why, what balancing God and government? Like the government, you're in a government job. Isn't government secular? Like, why should we be concerned about having Christian soldiers? Well, what does that have to do with the secular work of defending the country?
Biblically speaking, secular is not a concept. You have either you're a worshiper of Yahweh or you're a worshiper of false gods. And so I think that one of the things that would help the discussion move along is to get rid of this secular category. When we see the application of believers in Yahweh in the Old Testament, they were soldiers also. The men were expected to go out to war to take the promised land. And so this idea that we don't want to have do you want to have unbelieving soldiers who have no basis for ethics in terms of war,
or justice,
right? Who are not willing to stand up for what's right, even though they're being ordered to do what's wrong?
And we've heard horrible things about soldiers who just go, slaughtering whole villages and things like that.
You've got the people with necklaces with ears or teeth.
Yeah, no, it's happened.
Right.
It's been documented.
Right,
Yeah,
and
whole villages slaughtered.
Right, and so
Yeah.
do you want Christian soldiers or those ones?
Yeah,
and so but more than that, when I was doing my annual training, I hadn't anticipated this. Although having talked to other chaplains afterwards, they didn't seem surprised. But they were, I don't know, it seemed like every other day I was counseling someone. And if not the same person, more than once. And so there were, not to be, get into specifics, I deal with things like people who have suicidal thoughts, there's one soldier who was concerned about his fiancée, who was 5 months pregnant, murdering her child through the process of abortion. And he couldn't have the kind of conversation with her that he needed to have with her over the phone and text. And so I had the opportunity to get involved in terms of making a recommendation for his spiritual health and mental well-being that he leave the annual training sooner.
So he could go be with her and help her do the right thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because the way I present it influences the outcome to a degree. My overseeing, the people who are above me in terms of the battalion have to be convinced it's in the battalion's best interest to send the soldier home. And so how it's presented on my part has to consider that, because ultimately I am first and foremost under the battalion commander and the XO, the executive officer. And those are who I report to, and those are who I'm trying to assist in the process of encouraging the spiritual well-being of all of the soldiers. And so I am also religious counsel for them. So if I got deployed and we're in another country, one of my jobs is to be aware of the local religious issues, so that way I can give counsel to the people making the decisions in terms of how these issues might affect the mission. And so my job is still to move the mission forward.
Yeah.
But my primary focus is on the well-being, particularly the spiritual well-being of the soldiers.
This discussion, then we talk about God and government and you ministering to the spiritual well-being of the soldiers, I know it isn't valued much in our day, but we're really talking about authority, right? Because you said there's no such thing as secular. And that's true. There is no such thing as secular. What we're talking about is authority. And when you are counseling these soldiers, what you're doing is you're bringing the the authority from God that they need to listen to. It's God is the one who institutes all authority, and right, like, so why, when this whole idea of secular whatever, the term we hear in our day is Christian nationalism. Well, what does that mean?
So there are some good points that people on the Christian nationalist side bring up, and they're very similar to the points that I brought up in terms of, would you prefer Christian soldiers or non-Christian soldiers, right? Would you prefer Christian politicians or non-Christian politicians? And if you are not sure about that, then look, at, in various states like California or Michigan, in terms of what some of the government has done there in a more liberal place, or even Hawaii most recently, where the government is suggesting that they buy up or they get all the land that was burned? Or do you want somebody who has biblical values? And those are good points to make. I mean, of course, we would prefer that. I think the error is on the emphasis of that's a way that we accomplish the goal of Christ, which I think should be the focus should be on the gospel and proclaiming the gospel. And while people that hold a Christian nationalist position, in my experience, are not, they're not forsaking the gospel, it seems to be that the overwhelming emphasis is on the means to accomplish the work. And so the Great Commission is to make disciples. And so if that does make and I think that, if all the churches everywhere were to be faithful in proclaiming the gospel, like the true gospel, the gospel of grace, then there may very well be a change in our culture that would have an effect on our government. But it's not about trying to, strategically gain an advantage in living circumstance, so then that way the gospel can go forth. The gospel is the power. It doesn't need help.
Right.
And so I think that the emphasis that is often put forward on the Christian nationalist side, it risks undervaluing the primary act of bringing the kingdom, which is just proclaiming the gospel.
Yeah. So Christian nationalism is really, it's kind of a bit hard to pin down exactly what it is, but it seems to be shaping up to be this idea that somehow we can take back the country by voting in the right people who are Christians. Like somehow we can. There's power in taking over the politics, and in the post millennials who believe that we can so Christianize this world that
it's the idea of ushering in the kingdom through our practical efforts in evangelism and in life. And so I think that in a lot of ways, the Christian nationalist movement mirrors in practice post-millennial eschatology. And they treat those who would not share their view as pessimistic, which is often what's associated with people who hold to a pre-millennial eschatology, and that you're just waiting for it to burn. And so it's really interesting because I think in one sense it's an overreaction to people not being involved. And we should, as Christians, as human beings, be involved in our community. The word politics has to do with the people. We should have opinions on the people and politics, and it should be informed by a Christian worldview. I think it's an overreaction to the idea that ends up happening in a lot of churches where it's, us four, no more, shut the door, right? Like it's about us and our people and not about what's going on around us. And there seems to be this kind of overswinging the pendulum to the other side, which becomes a more pragmatic approach. And so there needs to be a focus on the priorities. So I'm not overly fond of suggesting balance per se.
Right, between God and government. Is
right,
that what you,
or between that, or even like in this topic, I think that it's just having right priorities, and you can be all for that, right?
Right.
One of the most stable positions you can have is, with proper leg width apart, standing there. But that is not the best position to be in if you're trying to sprint. If you're trying to sprint, you need to be leaning forward and pushing off the ground because it's the direction you're going. And so the idea of being the most balanced may not be what's best for the
Depending
operation.
on what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that we need to be zealous in terms of the gospel,
Right.
but also willing to engage the culture in terms of what does the Bible have to say with what I see what's right in front of me.
Right. So we're, this whole discussion of God and government and you being a spiritual authority in the lives of these soldiers, this is not the same thing as Christian nationalism. This is not saying that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to, I remember it was Vlach who would always said, Jesus needs feet on the ground to bring in the kingdom. You need Christ as king on the throne, stepping down in this earth before he brings in the millennial type of justice and reality. So we're not trying to create a millennial kingdom. And I think that's what you're saying. The fundamental flaw of Christian nationalism is it's a millennialism of some sort.
It's also it's with the wrong goal or end in mind. I mean, ultimately, and so I'll step back for a second. I think it's perfectly acceptable to hold office as a Christian.
Yeah.
I think it's good. If you're in a position to do that, I would much prefer you as a Christian to do that than somebody else. And in a sense, it was the Congress had to take part in me becoming an officer in the military. And so I have that kind of, in a sense, official capacity. So that's not the problem, but what am I trying to accomplish? And so I have a very simple goal that I'm trying to accomplish, which is for the soldiers to have peace. But the only way to have peace is to be reconciled to God through Christ.
Yeah.
And so because I have that, there are some people who have the role that I'm in who think that means just making them feel better about the circumstance.
Yeah.
And so while I think tending to those kinds of things in a conversation can be helpful and good, my goal is that they have true peace, not this temporary, I feel better about myself. But I know that regardless of the circumstance, I will be able to come out the other side because my trust is in the unmovable, perfect one, the King of all creation, the sovereign controller. I think that there's a tendency to be too wrapped up in, how does he get through this in the moment? Even in giving counsel, I need to make sure that what I'm not doing is compromising what God has said to bring somebody along regardless of their beliefs. And so I am very explicit in terms of so the things I'm going to say have to come from what I believe because this is what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
Because God's in charge of all things.
Right.
And so I often start off my conversation that way because I want there to be no ambiguity that what I'm telling you in terms of, propositional truth concerning the scripture is not a matter of opinion. Right. This is what is. While I still might offer some practical solutions in terms of how to handle circumstances or interpersonal conflict, ultimately when I'm saying this is true, I need to be making sure that I'm not as concerned for my longevity in my job as I am for God being properly represented on the basis of what he said. Right.
And this is exactly where I was driving at. What we're talking about here is a biblical theology of God and government. All authority is derived from God. God is the one who is the true authority and power. And because all authority is derived, God instituted government, which means Romans 13 is all about us submitting to a government who's submitting to the authority of God. Mm-hmm. And so this is what it comes down to. Being a chaplain is bringing the authority of God to bear on the lives of those soldiers. And so there is no such thing as secular. Like what you need to do and what you're doing is you are pointing people in the military, in your case in the Army, to the authority of God. Right. And that means that when it comes down to when the government says, well, you can't say this and you can't say that, you have to do you have to make a choice in that moment. Am I gonna obey God, who is the actual authority, or
Right.
am I going to obey man? Right.
Right. I think the passage, they leapt for joy because they were considered worthy of suffering for the
Yeah.
sake of Christ is, and has been in the past, a source of comfort for me. So it allows me to go forward knowing that my goal is not to pursue practical outcomes. My goal is to be faithful in the circumstance and let God determine the outcome.
Yeah.
Because first off, I don't have a choice. Using the word "let" there is just poor. My lack of ability to always speak properly of God. I don't let Him do anything.
Right.
But that's my job is to represent God in that circumstance. And so my position in the Army is very unique in that my job is specifically to be a religious person.
Mm-hmm.
And so in one sense, I have a lot of latitude that others might not, because it's not their job. And in another sense, especially in our modern day, this wouldn't have been an issue 20 years ago. But in our modern day, I have to be cognizant of the fact that I could be stepping on a landmine, but recognizing simultaneously that it's the Lord who directs my steps.
Yeah. Acts chapter 5, where the apostles are jailed, and then the officers come and they go before the Sanhedrin in Acts 5, verse 28, and the Sanhedrin and the high priest question them, and then they say, verse 28, "We strictly command you not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." Verse 29, "But Peter and the apostles answered and said, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" And then they went to pronounce condemnation on them because they put Jesus to death and they're rejecting Jesus, but then also to proclaim the gospel. He grants repentance and forgiveness of sins. And that's the mission, right? That's the mission whether you're in the chaplaincy or you're not in the chaplaincy.
Yeah. So the one of the unique things about what I'm doing with it is that I get to do what I do when I'm not there. I wear a uniform, and also there's other things that I get to do. Like I get to be counsel for some of the officers and the non-commissioned officers in terms of like their interpersonal conflicts. But nobody has any confusion as to what I believe. One of the best compliments I think I got by a number of people, and for different reasons, was that like, "We've never met a chaplain like you before." And to one of them, I replied, "That's because I actually believe the book that I say I believe. And I act like it's true."
And that is so desperately needed in the military. So desperately. Because these chaplains, a great majority of them are compromising on that.
I think a lot of them are.
Yeah.
I met a guy at some training who was, I think, considering switching endorsers, and particularly to the one that I'm part of. And he was moving out of the SBC, which is an endorsing agency also, because of his concern with the compromise of the Southern Baptist Convention, especially in light of things like the ERLC, which is their functionally leftist arm. And so he was looking for another endorsing agency he could be a part of, so that way he could be faithful. And so there's guys that are, so like there's maybe three kinds of guys. There's the kind who are faithful, the kind who are unfaithful, and then there's the guys who are really struggling to try to maintain being faithful, although they might have too much of a concern, in my opinion, for men over God. I think it's a lot easier not to struggle to be faithful when that's not a problem, but you have to come with that mentality. And this is true of us when we're, not at being a chaplain in the Army. This is true in any job. This is true, when you're at the store, the fear of men over the fear of God.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other people who are just collecting a paycheck. And so they're in the ministry, as it were, clearly not the Christian one, because they have a desire to gain. And so they'll, give attaboy speeches and just try to make people feel better about their lives while never confronting them in their sin or confronting them with their need for Christ and the Savior. And they're just trying to get by. And those are the ones that I have no sympathy for. They're those kinds of guys. And I'm not saying there's a certain amount of them or a certain percentage of them. They exist, just like they do in ministry. Those are the ones that I'm hoping to expose in terms of, are they really Christian chaplains?
Yeah.
By being the contrast.
That's right.
By demonstrating what it should look like.
You need to be able to say we must obey God rather than men, especially now in this day. So, I'm going to ask you two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. How can our listeners, how can we all as a church be praying for the military, and then specifically, how can we be praying for you?
Okay, so for the military, that the men and women who profess the name of Christ in it would have a boldness and would not compromise in terms of their faith. That's what the military needs, and that they're willing to stick by their biblical convictions concerning the truth that is being so strongly attacked right now. It's constant and it's aggressive. And we need more people just saying what I think a lot of us already know to be true, but are afraid to say it because we're afraid of the consequences. And I think the prayer for the military really is that the people who profess faith be faithful. For me in particularly, that applies also, right? But I think in terms of, the church and me, so I'm going to be gone for a few months. Pray that my wife is in a good way in terms of, with our children and being involved with the church. And then pray that people in the church be faithful to live out the one another's in terms of my family. And that those who recognize that they can be involved, act on it. My greatest prayer is that my wife be surrounded by the church while I'm gone, because she needs it. And I think that the way God's gifted our church, that there are plenty of people who can edify her by being in her life and my lives of my children while I'm not here.
All right. Good. Well said. We will commit to be praying for you and to be ministering to Alex, and I'm sure that others listening will as well. So thank you, Joseph. This has been an interesting discussion, and Godspeed to you as you go.
Thank you.
All right. Again, this has been a ministry of Faith Baptist Church in Visalia. And if you hear this, you're not part of our church, and you're in the area, come visit us 9:30 for Sunday school on Sunday mornings, and 10:30 for our main service, and then 6 o'clock for our Sunday night service. And we look forward to seeing you, and until next time.